Disclaimer. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
Thank you very much, everybody. So let's do this and see if it works. Thank you so much. I hope wherever it is for you is a nice, comfortable place of refuge. We all need that all the time. And so we are coming into a very, very important time in history, and we need to date stamp this because change is coming. And it's a great time to be here, and hopefully all of us will still be here once things happen, so that we can sit around the campfire and talk about the good old days and how we were there. So let's carry on the teachings, and welcome everybody to the Keshe American Knowledge Team meeting in 2025. And the American Knowledge Team meeting is welcoming all the knowledge seekers from all the other continents as well. And that's what makes this meeting so important. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. We are embarking on the intermediate INERCIA series. And of course, we're referred to as the four-wheelers. My name is Alexander. I'm from Canada. It is February the 9th, 2025. This is part of the Keshe Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So we completed last week one series, the Basic Inertia series, and which was a continuation of several years, where we're trying to distill all the knowledge down so that the new knowledge seekers can join us and just carry on and not feel like they've been left behind. Timing is everything. So if you're here, you're on time. That's all there is to it. But there's a lot of knowledge that happened before us, and we shouldn't be critical of that, because let's face it, a lot of history happened before we were born here as well. So we're all newcomers in a way, and we need to get with the program. But now we're going to continue into the intermediate inertia series. But let's remember, it's still basic teaching, and it just we get a little bit more in detail, and we carry forward a lot of things that we brought. And this is important for the mature teachers, because it fills in gaps where additional knowledge or a different interpretation of the existing knowledge comes to the fore. And so it gives us all a chance to, in some cases, revisit, and in other cases, to add to it, because we do have a difficult job ahead, and that is to explain to all the new knowledge seekers who are still stuck on the hesitancy highway and understanding what that is. That's the lowest energy state. And for us, our society is, for the most part, well paved. Maybe we have a few potholes, but our forefathers didn't have pavement, and they had vast frontiers to explore. And so here we are at the frontier crossroads now, where the old science and the new science is coming together. And we understand that there's a resistance. But in order to go from here to there has to be some kind of progress. And so we have to understand that we came here from somewhere. And where we came from was from outer space, and where we're going to is outer space. And in between, we're always searching for outer space. And so what we're trying to do is to pave the infrastructure paths on the plasma highway to our little pie in the sky. And right then and there is where part of the problem lies, is because we're so content with our little pie in the sky, and that's okay. Everyone has a vision of what their pie in the sky should be, but let's remember that our pie is just a piece of the whole pie. And so we all need to keep our pie as healthy as possible. Just like one bad apple can spoil the bunch. And we see where we have some problems, but we don't focus on the problems. So we're focusing on the solutions and trying to understand the solutions, and trying to understand why we're stuck on this hesitancy highway. So with the books of Merentepe Cash, in book number 1, we've seen the universal order of the creation of matter. And in many ways, we're going to review some of that today to reinforce what is the difference between the matter, dark matter, and antimatter. What we have to understand, those are all 3 different energy sources or energy states, and they come together and they converge into the creation of matter. And so this creation of matter is what we refer to in advanced science as inertia. A lot of people think that inertia is the force in one direction and creating a force equal and opposite in the opposite direction. And that also is true to a certain extent. So we see in book number 2, the structure of the light, how the light comes. And so if we understand about the conventional definition of inertia, then we have to understand that the light comes from somewhere. And so if the light is coming to us at light speed, then it must be leaving somewhere at light speed. And there must be an equal and opposite force at light speed. Okay, well, that was a little bit shocking. And in book number 3, then we look at the origin of the universe, and we say, well, wait a sec, we just created matter, and now we're going to split it up. And through that split, we have the origin of the universe. How can you have the origin of the universe split up from the creation of the matter? So when everything that we see is our universe. Now we really have a dilemma. And so we've been trying to impart 364 weeks in a row through the one planet, one nation, one race for justice and world peace, bringing together the members of the Universal Council as hosted by Rick Crammond to understand that the reason that we're only seeing half the project is because the universe is a peaceful place and the humanity is not a very peaceful race. So we are given commandments. And we all know how we appreciate commandments, especially when they come from our parents and say, you know, don't do this and don't do that. Well, in terms of plasma science, not doesn't work because energy is always positive and energy is always in motion, as we keep saying. So there's a real flaw in the 10 commandments. And there's a second flaw is that there were a lot of missing commandments. So we've got our case of 2-4, and this is pretty good for all the Canadians. But, you know, do we understand these things and why do we need these things? And does that mean that the 24 commandments are an executive order? And then the question becomes is, who is that executive order? And, you know, when we look at some of the executive orders and they talk about influencing how we live, which is really kind of strange. And because how we lived was here before the executives were. But anyway, we're looking for that plasma highway and trying to figure out where it is. So fundamentally, it's the highest energy state. So that means there are lower energy states. And so we understand that there was a transmission highway. And on that transmission highway, we have frequency, heat, and pressure, or frequency, temperature, and pressure, shall we say. But when we start to elevate, we get into the transition highway. These characteristics dissipate. And then with the transition highway, we have an option. We can stay there, we can go to a higher energy state, or we can return back to the lower energy state. And is it nice to have options as opposed to having commandments? And then there's a transmutation highway, which obviously is the way we were born. And we know that because we don't know how we were born, and we don't know how to get on the transmutation highway. So there's a common denominator. So what do we know? We don't know that much. That's what we know. And we need more to learn. Well, how do we do that? And so we learned about the carbon inertia highways. And when we see that really it's two-sided, double-sided, not to be confused with double dealing and two-faced. But when we look at the combination of the lowest energy state, the carbon-12 and the carbon-12, that comes out to 24. But the ratio is 1-to-1. When we go to the transition state, the ratio carbon-14 to carbon-10 is 1.4-to-1. And when we go to the transmutation state, the ratio of carbon-16 to carbon-8, well, that's 2-to-1. So the total on every level is carbon-24, but the ratios are changing. So what does that tell you? That tells you that the rules are the same on each level, but the ratios change. And so what causes that change? So it's the same change that we see when light travels at light speed within the containment of the Earth. And most of what we see, and when we say we, humanity, what we see is visible light. But there is non-visible light, and we pride ourselves on seeing the results of X-rays. So we don't see the X-rays, but we are able to see the result of the X-rays. So that is also based on the X-ray light. So whether we see the light or whether we see the results of the light, that tells us that it could be a reflection or it could be an illusion. And do we know which we're looking at, and how do we make that decision? So then we come to the point where conventional science is based on nuclear forces. And so the obvious question is, how big is large? Because of the premise is that weak nuclear forces are far. So our perception is that weak nuclear forces are weak because they're far away. But because they involve planets, they may be far away and they may appear to be weak. We know that planets are a lot bigger than we are, and all we have to do is look at our Earth, and that confirms that planets are bigger than us. So these so-called weak nuclear forces must be really, really strong. So our perception is that they're weak only because they're far. And so when we look at the strong nuclear forces, we say they're strong because they're near. Well, what is near to us? Well, obviously, the atom. And you can see how tightly wrapped the atom is because we have all these elements on this planet and all these things, and they're all wrapped up in these atomic structures, and they're very strong. They appear very strong to us, but they're strong because they're near. But since they influence things that are really tiny, very tiny, I mean, so tiny you can't even see it. So these strong nuclear forces are only appearing to be strong because they're near, but in fact, they are very weak, because when you compare them to the weak nuclear forces, they are certainly much weaker. So then we can conclude that the far nuclear forces are actually strong, and the near nuclear forces are actually weak. So if nuclear forces can be weak or can be strong, then in discussing nuclear forces, we can't really tell if they're weak or if they're strong, because if we were to bring those far forces near us, then would those weak nuclear forces be perceived to be strong for us? And if that were to be the case, then what would cause the change in that strength? So if we just say, well, those forces are weak and those forces are strong, it's like saying, wow, is that ever big? Oh, really? And how big is it? Oh my God, it's really, really big. I mean, it is really big. Is it bigger than the gap between that a one-armed fisherman would show? How big is the fish that he caught with his one hand? I guess it was really big. And what about the other fisherman who brought the big fish, but he had to climb over the mountain to come into the valley that didn't have a lot of water? Maybe just had a small river. And the people there were saying, wow, that's a big fish. Where did you get that big fish? It would have to be in a big pond of water. Yes, that pond of water is on the other side of the hill. You want to come and see it? And they say, well, you know what? What we see is what we have. And there ain't no big lake to hold that fish. So we don't see the lake, but we don't see the fish. And that's how you get stuck on the hesitancy highway. And it's, I would say, sad. And so we only acknowledge what we see. And so what we see is what we get. And so we must conclude that if we only see what we get, then we only get what we get, and we don't get what we don't get. In other words, what we don't see is what we don't get. But there's no accounting for saying that it doesn't exist. You don't want to cross the mountain? You don't have to. Stay in the valley, and you know what? This is how we value life. We just nickel and dime things. And so maybe the difference between the V and the X is one is only half the picture. So in Roman numerals, the V is 5. And in Roman numerals, the X is a dime. And since today is Super Bowl Sunday, we know that all defensive coordinators are alternating between the nickel and dime defense. And if you don't know what that is, then obviously you're not a football fan. But anyway, what we're talking about is inertia contention. Yes, we're still talking about inertia because what we've seen is that in order to go from the transmission dimension to the transition dimension, that's 1 and 1. And the combination of those two takes us to 2, which is the transmutation dimension. Okay, well, that takes care of one dimension, but what happens if we're in the transmutation dimension and we want to go to the transmission dimension? We have to reverse our path. In other words, the transmutation dimension would be 1, the transition dimension would be 1, and now the transmission would be the sum total. 1 and 1 is 2. And so that's the inertia contention, where you bring 2 field strengths together and you come up with 1. So with this particular thing, we could say by transferring energy states, we can manifest inertia fields. But still, we have no accounting as to how we do this. So there has to be some kind of transition state. And in fact, there's a transition junction. You know, first of all, you have one track where you go from the lower to the higher. So that's 1. And then that becomes the transfer state dimension. And that becomes 1. And then from that, we go to the transition matter of another track. And that becomes 2. So this is one way that we go through the plasma inertia junction from the lower to the high. Okay. But there is a midpoint. There is a medium point in the plasma inertia junction where the transition matter of the lower is 1 and the transition matter of the higher is 1. And the coming together is the inertia transfer state dimension, where 2 fields come together as 1. Well, what happens now? Well, here's the lobe, where the transition matter is one, the transfer state is one, and then the lobe transition matter becomes the inertia state. So therefore, we can go from one track and get to another track, but there is a third track. And so that just changes the whole game. So now when we talk about the surface to volume ratio, if we're going to discuss a sphere, which is three-dimensional, and that means 1 plus 1, not the same one, plus another one, not the same one as the previous two, but coming together are more than 3. And it's more than 3 because you still have the 1 plus the 1 plus the 1. And now you have the 3. So the 3 ones are part of the feeding dimension, and the 3 is part of the feedback dimension. And we're none of these dimensions. We're the observers of these dimensions. And because pi is only 3.14 and a bit and a bit and a bit, we just get the chance to fudge everything. You know, just round it off to the nearest $1 trillion. So there is a conservation of energy, however, where the energy transfer state itself is a maggrav. And so we have a possibility of transferring energy and balancing it out on each state, whether it's atomic, nanostate, or GaN state. But we can also transfer energy between states. So now we have a clear path where 1 plus 1 could be 2 on the same state, or could be 2 by changing energy states. And so, you know, we have an option. And really, now we have to take into account if 1 is equal to 1 and not the same 1, is it the 1 in the GaN state, or is it the 1 in the nanostate? And those ones actually are not the same either, because they may be on the same side, but they're not of the same energy state. So there is no accounting as to say which equation you're going to choose or which path you're going to choose. But what you do know is now you have a choice. And is that choice restricted to only going one step down? So it is actually possible to go from the GaN state to the atomic state. And we do know that to be true because we've all done it in our homes. So when we're talking about the creation of the universe, it's coming together of the creation of matters. And since these matters exist from energy and it's always positive, but it's in motion. And so the charge is reflecting that motion, whether it's positive or negative. And if that is the case, it's coming to or going from something. And as we said, it can stay at the same energy state, or it can transition between energy states. But the energy transfer has to be in balance. And so the rules are, and they apply to all the states, the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. So the way we run our society, this could be a conflict point. But in science, that becomes a binding zone. And in that binding zone, there would have to be a common denominator. Because if there wasn't a common denominator, it wouldn't be a binding zone. it would be a separation zone. So the plasma rule would either create a binding zone or a separation zone, but it would not create a conflict zone. It's only us. We're just like crash test dummies, aren't we? Where we run collision experiments. And it all comes from our science, which likes to have atoms collide. And why is it that when cars collide, it doesn't work, but when atoms collide, you create this fusion manifestation? How is it to believe that you can do creation through destruction? And so, you know, when we have the artificial intelligence of a dummy, then, you know, it becomes a problem for us to sort this out. And so we continue with this point of collision. We have these contentious issues. And, you know, if we have a problem with cars, we have a bigger problem with trucks because trucks are bigger. So whether it's a small force or whether it's a big force, there's always a balance between the intensity and the outtensity. So these points of collision, and you could always say, well, it was a big accident. Oh, really? And how big was it? Oh, it was really big. And was it resolved? Or did it become a point of containment? Or as they say, you know, it was a train wreck. So maybe we have 18 wheels of fortune, not just 4. Well, this is all part of energy binding, and it's very important to have that because there's a self-serving need to do that. It's called existence. And that form of existence is an inertia field that manifests itself with our intention and the planet's intention. And there's a common denominator. So that's how we got here. So why are we forgetting how we got here and operating at the expense of others when everything that we need is at hand? But it's an acquired taste, isn't it? So when we do that at the expense of others, the others, well, let's face it, now they're lacking. And they need that energy binding for their self-serving purposes. So if it works for you, it might as well work for us. And so they do the same thing. And now you have a domino effect where everybody is binding their energy for self-serving purposes at the expense of others. And when we say others, which others? Well, you know, it is non-specified, undifferentiated. We don't care because we don't want to get emotionally involved. Because if we know which others they were, then we would have to decide, do I take the hand off the gun and caress my child, or do I put my hand on the gun and pull the trigger to kill your child? It's the same gun, it's the same hand, and it's a child of humanity. So what's the difference? And so we have to understand these tensity relationships. So it's not just scientific responsibility where we're seeking the magnetical and gravitational balance, what we call a MAGRAV, but there's also the spiritual responsibility where we have the magnetical gravitational balance of the spirit and the soul. And then if we bring those two scientific communities together, bringing together the awake state and the dream state and understanding how the plasma science adds to the knowledge, then we don't ask, is the plasma science verifiable? We ask, what causes the change And at what rate is that change? And where exactly are we able to get that information from? So what we see is in the cups of life that we have all been able to create without atoms colliding, without billions of dollars spent on atomic raceways where atoms collide. We've been able to take ordinary wires and nanocoat them using the principles of the monatomic science and bringing them together and creating various ganses. And some of those ganses were CO2, calcium, zinc, or copper. But then now comes the revelation that it can be amino acids or it can be water. And the key characteristic here is that they are all combination, which means that they're molecules. If they weren't in combination, they would be elements. So the fact of the matter is that we can produce an element, but we can also produce a molecule. And so test that theory, and we produce gold GANs. Isn't that interesting? And then if we can produce that, well, then we could produce a plasma feeding system. And as we go through and see how important it is to get fed, and there's a constant nagging, feed me, feed me, feed me. The question is, are you satisfied? Or are you still hungry? And how do you know the difference? So when we look at the track cup of man, we see there's an emotional track and a physical track. And so the cup of man becomes an inertia field combination of the emotional cup and the physical cup. So that's 1 and 1 is 2. But if we add the cup of the soul, which is another track, now we have 1 cup of the soul, 1 cup of the emotion, 1 cup of the physicality. And that comes together. And now we have 3. And so if we look at the 1 track cup of the universe, and we see how we need the copper GANs because that's related to our physicality, and we need the zinc GANs because that's related to our emotional energy. And then we have the carbogen GANs, which is related to the environment. And the bringing together of all 3 of those creates our manifestation of physicality. But that physicality can only manifest if there is a physicality to manifest too. So we also have a physicality of the earth. So we know that the soul of the man becomes an inertia of the mind of 3 field strengths. And the soul of the earth becomes an inertia of the earth mind. And it must also be a combination of 3 field strengths. And the reason that is true is because the earth and we, as humanity, are in the same universe. So we have to follow the same rules. And then we have 1, the soul of the physicality, which is another inertia manifestation, which is a combination of the interaction of the soul of the earth and the soul of the man. But we have more. And as a result of that moreness, we are able to enlist the services of the physicality of the earth. So that's another 1. And then the physicality of man. And that's another 1. So the combination, 3 and 3 is 6. And if the inertia is a coming together of 2 fields, you divide the 6 by 2, and look, we have 3 fields: the soul of the physicality of man, the physicality of the earth. Well, how convenient. And wherever you look on the earth, well, you have these elements, and they're very specific. So, now we can say that the earth is also practicing discrimination. And that's kind of a good thing because we can go someplace and see the copper, and someplace see the oil, and someplace see the gold. But there are other things. And these other things are all nicely arranged in the periodic table of disprejudice, which is a table that shows all the range details of the Earth space that we know of. And so we assume that's all the details. Big assumption. But the fact of the matter is, it's giving us a fairly well organized life. And each of these elements has a number, and that number is the number of protons. And every one of these elements has a neutron, except for one, the lonely one, the hydrogen. It doesn't have a neutron. So we count by the number of protons. So if we were looking at silicon, for instance, that has 14 protons. Or if we look at carbon, that has 6 protons. So we call that carbon 6. But in the references that we've been making, we call it carbon 12 because of the inertia fields. And what are the inertia fields? Well, it's the coming together of the neutron and the proton and the electron. So the fundamental principal matter is the PM6, which is magnetical, coming to us as an energy pack and converging as antimatter, dark matter, and matter in what we call the plasmagen conversion, which is not physical at that point, but it is an inertia field. And when we compare that inertia field to the field of the Earth space, then we can bring those two together and create an inertia field, which we call a MAGRAV, and bring our physicality there. So the rule being, of course, that the Earth has to be here before we get here because I guess, we'd get crushed. But when we look at the matter plasma dimension, we have to see that we only see the physicality because we could touch it and see it. And so that becomes the physical matter plasma. Whereas the plasmatic plasma, we can't touch it or can't see it, but we know that it's there. And so that's the other half, the part that we can't see. And so that part that we can't see, being of a higher energy strength, is the feeding strength, and the part that we can see is actually the feedback strength. And we are very feedback dominant, so dominant that, we try and rationalize as to what happened in the beginning. Well, in the beginning, the neutron came before the atom and the PM tick. And so we said, let there be light. Why? Why do we have to say, let there be light? Well, if you didn't have light, that means you had darkness. So if you already have the darkness, then you would never say, well, let there be darkness. So if you have the darkness and you want to have light, then you would say, well, let there be light. And so we have the light. And so the neutron split up to become the atom. But there was an energy consumption, and that was the PM tick. So the neutron becomes something, and there are byproducts. And so one splits up into 3. That's the opposite, isn't it? Where 1 and 1 and 1 is more than 3. Well, here we have 3, which is divided into 3 ones. Not the same one, but 3. And then, as we said, let there be light. Well, here we have hydrogen. That is a gravitational confirmation of the bringing together of these 3 fields. We have a magnetical field from the sun, and a magnetical field from the earth, and a magnetical field from the universe, and they come together. But we can't see the hydrogen, but the hydrogen can give a color emission spectrum, which is the fingerprint identifying hydrogen, and it is in color. It is in light, not white light, but a specific light, specific to the hydrogen light. And so that becomes its gravitational tracking fingerprint. And then, of course, same rules apply to oxygen, and the light that it has, well, it's different from the hydrogen. And so it has a different emission spectrum, and it's unique to oxygen. And so that becomes its gravitational tracking inertia. And then we have cells in the body. But we have trillions of cells in the body. And we have different cells. So when we look at each cell, it has a containment field, and in the center is the gravitational energy, and the outside is the magnetical energy. So, but they create a balance. But we don't know what energy state this cell is in, and we don't know which organelle it belongs to, and we don't know which organ it belongs to. We don't know its functionality, and we don't know its interaction. All we know is its containment. Well, thank you very much. And so we see that it mimics what we call the plasma chain. And so with the plasma chain, we see that energy follows a path. And one energy follows the path of another energy. However, there are many paths. And so there is no accounting for which path. And then there are different paths that are at a different distance from the core. So there's no accounting for the distance either. Okay, well, that doesn't tell us much, does it? So this interaction that we see with the cells must have an interaction with the plasma, because in order for it to maintain that containment, since energy cannot be held and energy cannot be stopped, it has to be in motion, then we give it a path within that containment to run around the track. And as it does that, it maintains a containment field that is a balance between the internal pressure and the external tensity. Because if the pressure is too large, it'll break the external tensity. And if the external tensity is very strong, then it will be able to resist the pressure. And maybe it can even reduce the pressure. So if we can increase or reduce the pressure, which is the containment field on the inside, being the gravitational field, and if we can reduce or increase the external intensity, which is the magnetical field on the outside, although we don't have an accounting as to how much pressure or how strong the intensity. What we do know is that there would be in this containment field a balance between the magnetic and gravitational field forces. And also what we do know is that the balance is changeable. And so what would cause that change? Because if we were to assume that nothing is happening, which in society we would say, well, that's just a deadbeat, right? Nothing happening there. But energy is always in motion, something is always happening. So we have this interaction, right? So there's an out-tensity interaction. So energy is going out and energy is coming in. And so that becomes part of the plasma chain tracking. So what did we do in the Wild West? Well, we had four-wheeler wagons. And when we wanted a field of containment, we would circle the four-wheelers and create, hopefully, a field of refuge. And hopefully, the out-tensity interaction with that field of refuge would be peaceful. So whether this practice of circling the wagons was effective or not, well, it remains to be seen. But what we do know is different in different circumstances. And different circumstances are governed by susceptibility. So if we are the ones who are observing this thing, and we are the ones in a different dimension, not the first three, but we're in another dimension, fourth dimension is observing. And if we know that energy is 1 plus 1, not the same one, and plus another one, not the same as the ones in the first two, but they come together and combine for more than 3, well, now the question is, do we have the susceptibility from the combination of the balance within an energy state like a GANS or nano or atomic state? Or do we have a connection between a plasma state, which is non-physical, and a physical state, and the sun? And we have choices. And how many choices do we have? Lots of choices. Because we have lots of elements on the periodic table of elements. So it isn't just door number 1, door number 2, or door number 3. It could be door number 222 or another door. I don't know. Because there's no accounting for the susceptibility here. But they say you are the light. Okay. So our manifestation comes from the light. So our manifestation came from the darkness, didn't it? Because what we are is what we are, and what we're not is what we're not. So if we are the light, then we are not the darkness. So what is the problem? And the problem could be that as humanity's civilization evolves, we see that we're all different. We could be Asian or Native Hawaiian or Black or white or Hispanic or Middle Eastern or Alaskan, and we are all divergent. But I mean, let's face it, in terms of the common denominator, we all have the same story, the same flood, the Great Flood. And since we all have the same story, then we all should have the same point of view, don't you think? And if we were all, part of that story, then we're equal. Same story, it's equal. It's not your story or it's not my story. It's our story, the story of the humanity civilization. But things change. And the reason they change is because there is a sequencing. This is an energy sequencing. So we have at the lowest end a magnetic energy, and we have electric, electromagnetic, and on, atomic, nuclear, and plasma, and on, and the soul of the body, the soul of the man. And are these all of the sequences? How can they be? These are just some of the choices that we have. And we only need to choose 3. But we could choose 3 within each state. So we can choose 3 in the plasma state, or we can choose 3 in the atomic state. Or we could choose 3 different states. And then there's in between states. So, it's hard to judge because one's bigger than the other. And then you say, well, it's really big. Well, how big is it? Well, it's electric big. Gives you a big shock. Or it's atomic big. Gives you a big blast. Or it's plasma big. It gives life. How big is it? Well, I'm not sure. So what we are sure is that the rules are the same. And they are the magnetical rules of attraction and repulsion. So the attraction has an intensity that is gravitational. So that's part of the feedback that we know of the magnetical energy, which is the outensity, which is part of the feeding. And so when we look at the rules and we say the rules are the same, then how can we tell the difference between an electron and a neutron? When the universal order of creation of matter doesn't differentiate between an electron or a neutron, because an electron is matter and a neutron is matter. So the rules are the same. So from that perspective, the electron and the neutron are the same, are equal. So when we look at the core component of a containment, and let's say it's an electron, as we said, it's the combination of 3 different energy states, matter, antimatter, and dark matter. But we say that the electron is magnetical because it's tiny. And then, of course, there's the big neutron. I don't know how big it is, but it's way bigger than the electron, like really big. But it's comprised of the matter, antimatter, and dark matter. But because it's big, it's a gravitational. Okay. Well, now we look at the core component and compare. And we say, well, they're made the same. They are equal, but the neutron is bigger than the electron. Because if the electron was bigger than the neutron, we would call the electron the neutron, and then the neutron would be the electron. And if you find that confusing, then you understand the confusion between the strong and weak nuclear forces. So that is not the factor. Something else is the factor. So we can discount those two. And we can look at life being a two-way street, where we have the relationship between natural creation and natural decay. But that would be a balanced field based on the outintensity relationship with the intensity, which we've already said that that is variable. And if that is variable, then the emission strength of the magnetical field and the absorption strength of the gravitational field is also variable. And if it's variable, to what degree does it vary? And so here we are as the four-wheelers of a creation. We see, well, we have creation where we make something, and then we have destruction, and we have to make that as well. And so to understand how these things work together, then we create something to destroy. And so there is a bond between those two. And that too becomes an inertia bonding factor. But it's kind of imprecise because when you make a weapon, it's intended to kill, but it doesn't specify who gets killed. So we just kind of fudge things, right? It's okay to make the weapon as long as someone else pulls the trigger and as long as someone else becomes the receiver of the bullet. And here we are. We're amino acid four-wheelers because we're not only bringing in the oxygen and the hydrogen, but now we have the carbon and the nitrogen as well. And we have what we call a star formation. So that star formation is not elemental. It's a combination. It's a hybrid. It's multiple components coming together. So there is a Ganss of connection because there is an outer limit. So the moment you say there's a limit, then when you come close to that limit, then you have to automatically realize you're coming back. And how sharp is that return? How flexible is that return? How graceful is it? Is it a gentle curve where you just kind of rotate around and roll around and come back? Or is it a sharp hairpin turn? So we see that there are what we call vanishing points at that junction, at that apex of the turn. And there we see a shine, a luster. And of course, it is very small. And so that could be a hairpin turn if you want to stay on the road. But as we look down that road of asphalt, we know that we can see it is shimmering in the distance. And that shimmering is totally different from what we see when we look down at our feet and we see the asphalt. So the only time really when we pay attention to this is, of course, when we're driving. And so our wheels are rolling on the asphalt and we look down in the horizon and we see the asphalt is shimmering. but it's not shimmering underneath the tires. We're just rolling along. And as we roll along to this vanishing point, things can change. Maybe we have a bulging. It's not just bigger, but it's bigger in one part where you have a changeable relationship between the intensity and the outintensity. So the dynamic field remains intact. You still have the containment, but the conformity is variable. So, maybe you were skinny and now you're a little bit fat, but the conformity remains intact within this field. But there are many fields within that field, so the conformity can vary across many fields. So bulging is the conformity of overlapping fields, isn't it? So these fields are all within that field. And so when we look at a field of energy and we see that there is a bulging at the surface, but there has to be a containment within that field. And then that containment within the containment field has to have the ability to move through that field and get to the surface of the field where it can cause a bulging. And this is where we see that with the bubbles, isn't it? Because we see that there are some bubbles that are contained on the surface of a bigger bubble. And then there are bubbles that come out of the bigger bubble. But the thing you have to notice is that the bubbles on the surface of the bigger bubble are smaller than the bigger bubble. And the bubble that left, that is connected by the outintensity, is also smaller than the bigger bubble. So how big is the big bubble? Well, I don't know. Well, how small are the small bubbles? Again, I don't know. But what I do know is that there is a stability between the big bubbles and the smaller bubbles. So are all bubbles the same? Well, let's look at Saturn, for instance. It has visible rings. So that's a containment. But it has visible shadows between the rings. Well, that's another containment. And then there's the body of the planet itself. And it's not a ring, it's a sphere. So the body of the planet is different. And between the planet and the rings is another gap. So what we do know about the neutron is that the neutron is in the center. And so if we were just to look at the spherical relationship of the planet, we would say, well, there's a neutron in the planet. But if we were to remove the planet and just leave the rings behind, in order for the rings and the gap between the rings to maintain their field of containment, there would have to be a neutron in the center of the rings. Has to be, because the neutron is gravitational, the rings are magnetical, and there has to be a balance. So, which neutron are we talking about? Or can one neutron accommodate all three? We say, okay, well, we know there's a neutron at the center, and there's a neutron of the planet, and then there's a neutron of the rings. So are they different? Or is it all the same? I don't know. So when we look at the fundamental principle of the twinity, we see that the creation of the twinity is determined by the speed of rotation of the plasma of the electron, and is dictated by the amount of the magnetic fields which are transferred from the large twin plasma of the proton. So that field is transferred to the smaller twin plasma of the electron. So the electron is the twin of the proton, and the proton is the twin of the electron, but the proton is 1,849 times bigger than the electron. That doesn't make sense. So the electron and the proton are twins. One's a lot bigger than the other, a lot bigger. And by the way, where's the net neutron? Well, funny thing happens when the intensity of the big bubble bursts. So we see a dissolving of the density of the big bubble. And isn't that what we see with the cover of book number 3 in the creation of the universe, where one splits up into two? And the one dissolves. It's no longer there. So if we say that the density is there because of the neutron within the big bubble, and if the big bubble disappears, well, then the neutron must disappear. So then the question comes is the mass of the neutron that disappeared equal to the mass of the tiny bubbles that used to be at the surface and now are liberated? Or the other bubble that was already released, but you understand that the other bubble that was released was not released to cause the big bubble to burst. So the bubble on the left corner was released while the big bubble was intact. But now, as the big bubble is dissolving, the other smaller bubbles are being released. So what that means is that the big bubble in the bottom corner was able to be released and had enough energy to release itself from the big bubble, and the smaller bubbles did not have enough energy to be released. It took the demise of the big bubble to release the smaller bubbles. And so now you have these other bubbles, and the big bubble is gone, and the neutron of that big bubble is gone. And clearly, that big bubble was way bigger than what was left behind. Well, where exactly did it go? So what we're seeing is that there's a transference of gravitational dominance. And this is happening at the point of substitution. So we know that the dissolution of that bubble, the intensity is gone. It equals 0. And because 1 equals 0, then the out intensity also equals 0. So we have a gravitational conformation because we have some bubbles left over. But we also have a gravitational conformation that the big bubble has dissolved. So some of that neutron remained, but most of it is gone. And so we can see that the substitution point is within the black hole field. And why can we see that? The reason we can see that is because we can't see it. It used to be there, and now it's gone. So when we hear a car approaching, we hear it coming towards us, and we know it's coming towards us because the sound is getting louder and louder and louder. So, the energy is increasing, isn't it? And then once it passes us and goes away from us, well, the energy is getting weaker and weaker and weaker. So then the question becomes, is the sound strong or is it weak? Or is the energy near or is it far? And so it was far, and then it came near, and when it was far, it was not so loud. And when it came near, it was really loud. And then when it went far again, it wasn't so loud. So which is it? Is it near or is it far? Or is it loud or is it soft? And so there's a ratio with this sound, which kind of tells us how near or how far. If we remember, we talked about Herman Weyl. And what he said was a definite portion of matter occupies a definite part of space at a definite moment in time. At a different part of space and a different moment of time is a different portion of matter, another definitive portion of matter. So that conclusion is that there's no such thing as one and the same energy, which constitutes a charge at two adjacent increments of time. So in other words, if you bake a cake today and you bake a cake tomorrow, you can do whatever you want, but it's not going to be the same cake. It may be close, but it's not going to be the same because there are principles of flow and connection. And if we understand that, then we understand how today is the beginning of the rest of our life. And so we don't need to carry the baggage of what we have brought to this point. And so when we look at the science, we see the flaw there. And we've been carrying this baggage for a long, long time. So we say on the periodic table of prejudice that carbon has 6 protons. Another element is radon, and it has 86 protons. So position number 6 on the table is carbon, and position number 86 is radon. But we call it carbon 12. And how we arrive at carbon 12 is because we assume that if we have 6 protons, to balance it out, we have to have 6 neutrons. So the mass is the combination of the 6 protons and the 6 neutrons, but because they are so big, I mean really big, we don't even count the electron. So 6 and 6 is 12 and a bit, like a 0, 1, 0, 7, give or take. Anyway, we just fudge that, call it carbon 12. And the ratio, 6 protons to 6 neutrons, is 1 to 1. So therefore, we can conclude that the balance of the number of neutrons within the nucleus is equal to the number of protons. And then we look at radon, and wait a second. We claim that it has 136 neutrons. So if we were to say that the mass of the carbon of 6 protons plus something to get up to 12, or to say it another way, the mass of 12 minus the 6 protons gives us 6 neutrons. And and the mass is 6 and a bit, but you know, it's 6. So we divide 6 by 6 neutrons, and we came with the mass of 1 neutron. And that mass is, equal to the mass of a proton. But we know it's not equal. The proton is slightly less because it has an electron. So the mass of the proton plus the electron, it equals the neutron, but it doesn't exactly quite equal, but it's close enough. So we could say that we have a 1-to-1 ratio of protons to neutrons. But you know, when you look at the radon, it has a 1 to 1.58 plus a bit and a bit and a bit ratio. That's not 1 to 1. So what kind of neutron is it? Because if we say that the neutron in the radon is the same as the neutron in the carbon, then there should be 86 neutrons in the radon, but there's 136. It's a problem. So I think we are starting to see the smoke screen. It's another theory up in smoke. And this is what we say as we're trying to get faster and faster in our life. Where does the rubber exactly meet the road? And then the popular saying, of course, it's better to burn out than fade away. Yes, it's a lot of fun. But, you know, here we are going nowhere very fast. So the reality is that neutrons are not all the same size. And neutrons are not all the same mass. So when we're looking at the roadmap to the plasma highway, we see that we can position the carbon-12 on the transmission highway, carbon-13 on the transition highway, and carbon-14 on the transmutation highway. And the feeding is not balanced because we find that the feeding from the carbon-14 is 80%, and the feeding from the carbon-12 is 20%. And so that ratio is 4 to 1. But when we look at the energy state, and the change from carbon-12 to carbon-13 is an order of 1 magnitude at least, and the change from carbon-13 to carbon-14 is an increase of 1 order of magnitude at least, then we find that an order of magnitude is 10 times, and 2 orders of magnitude is 10 times 10, which is 100 times. It doesn't balance out this 80-20 unless the 80 is the energy that we're getting from the higher energy field, which is way stronger, really big. And the energy that we get from the physical field is like really weak. So when we feed ourselves because we're weak. And so when we feed ourselves, we get strong. But if the feeding that is coming from the intensity feeding of the carbon-14, that is way stronger. Which means that the food that we're getting from the physicality, although it makes us stronger, is weak. But the food that we get from our physicality based on nearness and proximity is near to us. And the feeding that we get from the carbon-14, well, that's so far away. Well, how far away is it? And so we find that we're not feeding 24 hours a day. there are gaps in our feeding. So we feed, and then we fast. And then we feed again, and then we fast. So there's a changeability, there's a variability. And then we find that when we look at the universe, we see how well organized it is. But when we see the humanity civilization, something in the core is not right. There's a binding energy in that core, and where it causes all the different civilizations of humanity to be in conflict. And if you are in conflict with your neighbor, that can manifest into a conflict within yourself, within your own community. Because there's no accounting for it to stay contained within the civilization as a whole or the individual civilization as a part. So the entire civilization has a field of contention, and it's not healthy. And then the entire humanity civilization shares that contention, and it's not healthy either. So what we can say is that the unhealthy aspect of the humanity civilization on this earth is not the same as the unhealthy situation within each of our civilizations. Some are weak and some are strong, and some are near and some are far. But all the contentions are unhealthy. So when we talk about the four wheelers of humanity, there's the wheel of contention, the wheel of retention, the wheel of intention, and the wheel of attention. And so we are what we see, and we are also what we don't see. We have to learn to see what we don't see. So there's more than what meets the eye. So when we look at the universe, all we see is what we see, which is the sun space, the earth space, the moon space, and the space in between all of these spaces. And they're part of all of the universe. And we see how each planet rotates around the sun, and the moons rotate around the planet, and they all stay on track. There's a balance. There's no contention. And they don't deviate from this track, which is a good thing, because these planets are way bigger, really big, way bigger than we are. So I'm really glad that they're taking care of that business, because I don't have the strength to do that. But the point here is that the out-tensity interaction creates a manifestation. So when we look at that bubble, which is variable in shape, variable in size, we know that it has a nucleus, and in that nucleus is a neutron. And then we can see that there's a separation on the out-tensity. And since the separation is part of the whole, then that separation involves a consumption. So the original field becomes smaller, but it's still contained. If the field becomes smaller, then the containment becomes smaller. And now we see that the neutrons are the limit of the containment. So the neutron mass must diminish due to the separation, because the separation involves consumption, and the consumption reduces the containment. And then you say, well, how big is it? I don't know. How big is large? So what we're talking about is the conservation of susceptibility. So each of us is an independent plasmatic variable. And because of that variability, it means that the neutron mass is a plasmatic variable, because conservation of energy is in balance. So we see the Earth space transmutation state is a balance of the three dimensions of the X, Y, and Z axis coming together, of two fields manifesting one inertia field of the physicality of the Earth. And then, of course, if we're going into outer space, in order for us to have a field of containment, we have to have an outer space transmutation state, which then also would be the amalgamation of the X, Y, and Z axis, the containment of three fields coming together with an inertia field of a containment of an energy state. And then wherever we are, and wherever we can see that we are either in the light or we're in the darkness. And now we know that whether we are on this side of the mountain or on the other side of the mountain, we are in the light. What it means is that if we start in the atomic state, go to the monatomic, then the polyatomic, then the plasma field state, we can go one step beyond. There is no limit. But if there's no limit beyond on the highest energy state, then there's no limit beyond on the lowest energy state, because you have to ask, how big is large? Well, how small is small? So we see we are now beyond the Sanya time. In the spring of 2024, we were in Sanya, and we saw that we could produce and manifest gold in the physicality. Gold from thin air, you say? Or is it from our amino acids, which is actually fat air? And so if we can see with ultrasound the fetus inside the womb, and if with x-rays we could see our bones inside our body, well, now we are beyond x-rays, beyond ultrasound, where we can see the connection of the soul of the man with the physicality, and we can see the interaction of the soul of the man and the physicality. And it's just one step next when we can see a clear image, a manifestation of our understanding of the pH maggraph of the plasma fields, because something is always something as opposed to being something else. And the speed of rotation affects that transmutation transition. And so we have choices. And the one choice that we all made, we didn't come to the red planet, we came to the blue planet, right? And this is our home, our Earth. And our Earth called for peace. And we are the peacekeepers. And there are many points on the field strength of the dove of peace. So we clearly need to do more research. And so we're asking all the top researchers around the world, prepare yourself. Join the new plasma research teams, because the Wild West is gone. We are in the new frontier. And so all of us are in one form or another doing transmutation flight training. And so here we have between February, March, and April of this year, we have the capability of every month doing more training. And then, of course, there's other courses where we're doing the training of the souls and the relationship between the field of the souls and the physicality. So that is another program as we expand our programs so that we can understand the principles of transmutation. So these ranges transition and transcend inertia fields of transmutation dimensions. The laws of conservation govern. The covalent, that's 2. The trivalent, that's 3. The tetravalent bonding attributes, that's 4. And so the containment of inertia is manifest through the contention of equality. So 2 members have to be equal, 3 members have to be equal, 4 members have to be equal. And the soul of the man cannot be abandoned. And the soul of the man cannot be compromised. So the outer color of man is based on the integration with the soul of the man. And it's a reflection of the integrity of the man. And it doesn't discriminate based on color. It's based on the nonlinear inertia unity, which is governed by the path link and susceptibility, where you have the convergence of the emission of attention and the emission of retention. That is an inertia field. It interacts to create an emission of intention. And this creates a balance of contention, the contention of equality. That's all it is. It's not a war. It's not a fight. It's life. And so all we have to do is turn our intentions and our antennae to the message feeding and the feedback manifestation and transmission tuning. We can transition from one station to another. And we can select where one force is magnetical and balanced off by the force selection of another gravitational force. So whatever we select, the resulting selections feed the magra of manifestation. And that selection manifestation is predetermined by us choosing the peace dome of intention. And so that emission of intention affects the standard folding deviation and leaves no room for war. Transmutation manifests imbalance with the peace dome and opens up and transcends the limitations of nuclear science and shows us the greater oneness. And how great is the greaterness? I don't know. How big is large? 576 weeks in a row. The Knowledge Seekers workshops have been publicly talking about the plasma science and how it can bring peace and prosperity to our planet. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute, teachings on plasma science, and welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers, learning about the new selection process of the new plasma science. There's a World Peace Treaty. Choose it. Sign it. So here we are, four-wheelers in a three-dimensional transcendent inertia. Well, there are no straight lines to connect the dots of the fields of inertia. So can we go into outer space without a peace dome? Not really. Is the inertia of the present governed by the dimensions of history? Who says so? And how do we impart the transition of energy states of inertia? Things we need to learn. So if we have sudden stops they make skid marks on the roads of inertia to that physical transmission dimensions. And so the plasma science is being delivered daily via the Peace Dome in exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new outer space age. And that's the end of the lesson. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Hello, is everybody gone?
I'm just waiting for the applause to end, Alex. Just a moment. There we go. Just a few claps left. Well, thank you very much for, again, sharing your understanding and bringing a beautiful teaching to all of us. Hopefully, we've taken more than bits and bobs from it. But again, we do thank you for your presence and your sharing and the way you look at this technology. Let's see if there's you've aroused any questions or comments from the participants. And again, you don't have to be from Canada to make a comment or ask a question.
Well, as we're all pondering the point spread on the Super Bowl game, I want to thank everybody for allowing me to continue to present. We are moving ahead as best as we can and trying to keep an eye for the newcomers so that we can gracefully bring them on board so that they too can share in the peace and prosperity of the universal community. So thank you all, and I'll let you carry on, Mark, and I'll just be here if there are any further questions.
Okay, very good. And you asked a question about creation through destruction. Do you want to elaborate on that at all? What you said, we can't continue this or trying to bring creation through destruction. But I was thinking, isn't this exactly what the black hole does? Or were you sort of referring to it in a different way? Because we know the black holes are pulling in stars and planets and asteroids and everything else, and then putting it through sort of a disposal and then releasing the raw materials out the other end. So is that creation through destruction, or do we look at it in a different way?
Something is always something as opposed to being something else.
Yeah,
And
these funny words confuse me when you talk like that.
well, you look at a car, right? And that car is missing a starter engine. Is it a car or is it junk? Is it car or is it something that needs to go to the scrap heap? Is it a car that could mean promise of transportation, or is it a dead weight? So, nothing has changed with respect to the car. It still doesn't have the starter motor, but your point of view has changed. So, when you say, it's garbage, is it really garbage? if it was garbage, I don't think the wreckers would be buying it. Because the garbage for one is the gold of another. And the black hole is the same way. Since in the universe, there is no planet called away. So you can't just throw things away. There is no way to throw. So you either have something or you have something else. And so you can create that. We see that creation happens only in the physical state. So if there's a building and someone takes tools and building materials and a crew and builds the building, and someone else goes and builds a bomb and the delivery system for the bomb and drops it on the building, well, both of them were creating something, except the results from the creation of the work crew was to create a building, and the results of the creation of the demolition team was to create rubble. So which one is the success story? So the success is dependent not on the result, but on the intention. And so if the intention is to create destruction, then you know what? We're in a great place. But did you ask the earth, what happens to the earth if, we carry on with this destruction? So, oddly, the NGOs are saying that we're headed for a climactic disaster. So
I think the NGOs are headed for a type of disaster as I'm reading the tea leaves at this point.
yeah, but the thing is, the more destruction on this earth, the more the earth becomes part of that destruction. So it's like you have
Well, don't
a
forget,
messy house.
Alex, we're taking down a lot of the structures on this planet. The feeding structure, the banking structure, the
Well,
energy
no,
structure. We're
I
taking
agree.
down a lot of structures.
I agree. It's just to understand, what is the difference? So as you build, then you are building the civilization. As you destroy, you are destroying the civilization. So each building that is brought is on the road towards civilization. And each building that is destroyed is on the road to barbarism. And this planet thrives on creation. It doesn't thrive on barbarism. So it's okay right now because our population is so small. There's lots of wide open spaces. So it's okay. I'll just leave my garbage here and I'll just move down the road and I don't have to look at the garbage. So you just leave the garbage behind. Well, who did you leave that behind for? So the next guy coming is to say, well, where did all this garbage come from? Oh, it came from the guy down the road. So, well, then I'm not going to go there because given time, there's going to be a lot of garbage down there because obviously they have perfected the manufacture of garbage. So you need to go in the opposite direction, and there you will be manufacturing creativity, which will be cleaning up the garbage. And so we just have to decide which direction are we going. So it's in our physicality because of the delay and consequences, then we can create this garbage. but only because we're looking at the one picture, the physicality. But every component of that garbage was created. So it wasn't created as garbage. We have reprocessed it into what we deem to be garbage. But when we started, it wasn't garbage. It was inventory. It was the supply chain. Here are all the things that we need to draw in to manufacture something that is worthwhile. And then we will have things that are left over, cut away, scraps. And that, we just look at it as garbage. So what happened? We bought it. We brought it. It wasn't garbage. And now it's garbage. How did that happen? Okay, it's a flaw. Because in the universal conservation of energy, there is no garbage. So that means if you create something on one side, you will be creating something on the other side. So whatever you create is edifying, is building up. So who in his right mind goes out to create destruction? It's someone who doesn't understand how the universe works. And there is a pain that goes along with that lack of understanding. And although it may not be obvious, it becomes obvious. So if you are, let's say, a drug dealer, let's say, and you're a big drug dealer, and you go home and someone mugs you and they steal your money, and hopefully they only steal your money and they don't shoot you, even though they threaten to shoot you. But all they want is the money. They don't want anything else. And why do they need that money? So they can afford the drugs that you're pushing. So if you are creating wealth, that wealth doesn't give you peace. And so what are you going to do? You're going to call the police? You're already, an outlaw. So outlaws don't call the police. And are you going to be angry with him for robbing you? You shouldn't be angry because he's a customer. He's buying your drugs, isn't he? So there's enough suffering there. So what people end up doing is they end up moving into condos, which are really vertical caves, and moving into gated communities, which are just, every prison is a gated community, isn't it? So, it just becomes a point of view. What is gold for one is garbage for another. So what we have to understand is that there is no garbage in the universe. And so at that point in time, we carry a responsibility. And that is a big problem because we are indoctrinated that we don't want responsibility. And in fact, unfortunately, when you start to acquire responsibility, your reward is to get more responsibility. So we need to be skillful so that we don't get to the point where we break down under our burden of responsibility. That is not a burden, that is an asset. And so assets are for our betterment. And our betterment will only come around when the planet is better. And the planet knows the difference. Because when we leave, the planet gets better. So, and so when we have humans who want to get rid of humans on behalf of the planet, you don't need to convince me, just, leave already. It's an easy solution. But, you know, we have a bone of contention, don't we? And we like contention because it's profitable. Well, it may be profitable, but it doesn't bring us peace and harmony. And peace and harmony involves all of us. All of us involve all of us. There's not some of us. Some of us is not all of us. It includes all of us. So we can just pick and choose what we want to do and what is the result that we want. And the problem is we didn't know that we could pick and choose. So hello to the new space age. Go ahead, Mark. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Would someone else like to try a question? Alex keeps sinking my ship. No, he's actually elevating all of us. Thank you, Alex. Would someone else like to raise a point or a question? Now, you mentioned again the neutron. I know Mr. Kesh was talking quite a bit about it in this fusion and the rest of it. It sounded like you were saying once the neutron releases the energy that it's gathered to create the electron and proton, the neutron commits suicide. Is that what you were saying? It's only a one-time deal. It can only give one child, and then it goes kaput.
Well, you know, that's not true.
I thought that's what you were saying. The neutron
No,
ceases to exist.
That is one of the possibilities. We have choices.
Okay, so the neutron has a life expectancy, or in other words, it has a time of creation and a time of demise, or does it continue to move on, replicating the process?
The neutron represents the energy within the field of containment. So the exchange of the energy, the giving and the taking, affects the lifespan of the neutron. It also is representative of the conformity of whatever it is. So the key point here is that if you have a mass of the carbon and it has neutrons in its nucleus, which we say it does, so we assume that every element has a neutron and a mass. But we find now that the mass is not the same of each neutron. So therefore, the size of each neutron is not the same. And if the size of each neutron is not the same, but the size of the containment is governed by the neutron, which means the containment is in constant harmony with the neutron. So the definition of the containment is based on the mass of the neutron. So when we look at the light and the speed of light within the Coulomb barrier on this planet is also constant. But the color changes. The frequency of the light changes. The density of the light changes. If the density of the light changes, then the mass of the light changes. If the mass of the light changes, and we know from the periodic table that the mass of the elements change, then what we do know is that there is a constant relationship, but there is a variability. That is the plasma science. We have to understand how to manifest this variability. And by stepping on the gas and spinning our tires is going nowhere fast. So how do we get out of our little tiny piece of the pie? And our little piece of the pie is really tiny. And in fact, we're so attached to the pie that our neighbors can come in and turn it into rubble, and we still call it home. So, what is home? So before you were born, Earth was not home. And after you die, Earth is not home. But while you're here, Earth is home. And where you live is home. But if you move tomorrow on Earth to someplace else, well, that becomes home. So home is changeable, but you're still on Earth. And this becomes the point. If we have a consistency and a containment on Earth, and we can move around, then if we work within that containment field, we can move around. Well, how big is that containment field? Well, I don't know. How big is large? So what I'm saying is the electron is susceptible to strong nuclear forces because they're near, but they're really weak because the weak nuclear forces deal with planets, and we call them weak because they're so far away we can't feel them. But you take two magnets and you bring them near, and if they're powerful magnets and you get your finger stuck in between them, that'll be an ouchie. So, and the ouchie will be based on the nearness of the magnets and the field strength of the magnets. And the bigger the field strength, the faster they will come together, and the bigger the ouchie. So if we understand that, then we understand how life works. And isn't that mandatory for us to learn within our lifespan? So then the question becomes, how long is our lifespan? Well, I don't know. Some people live 10 years and some people live 100 years. So would you say a lifespan is, kind of in between? You'd have to say the lifespan spans, from birth to death. That's your lifespan. And so is that variable? Well, of course it is. Why wouldn't it be? If we can see that there's a variability in the lifespan, then the question of that variability is not the question. The question is what brings it. And what many of our preoccupied are with our nutrition, our food, our physicality. And we totally ignore the other half, the other side of the mountain. And remember, what holds the mountain up? Both sides. So there is another side. There has to be, because there is one side. And that's why you have a right side and you have a left side. So what is the problem in understanding that? You can go forward, you can go reverse with your card. What is the problem with understanding it? Here's the problem. Our body is a vehicle on the planet, and a car is a vehicle. So we take our vehicle and we put it inside another vehicle. That's why they call us four-wheelers. Back to you, Mark.
Okay, let's see. Thank you, Alex. And let's see if there's any other thoughts or questions anyone would like to bring. We'll have to go back and read book one again, as Mr. Kesh mentioned. I think in this workshop, go back to book one, or was it the previous workshop? Gail, have you been spending any time in book one? Would you like to make any statements about the neutron? I know you've been reading some passages in there. Anyone else have any thoughts, comments, questions? Okay, I think that concludes the Q&A period. Alex, I'm not hearing anyone voicing anything at the moment.
Well, thanks for being part of the Q part there, Mark.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. I have so much to understand.
We're having fun, I hope.
Yes. The fun has just begun. We haven't even seen it come into the market yet, but I think it's about to emerge for the beauty of the entire creation here. Just to remind everyone, there's a testimonial meeting tomorrow. If anyone has anything they'd like to share, it's in the public Zoom room. We all know the 939 number, and that starts at 8 p.m. Central European Time on Monday. And of course, it's the second Monday of the month. So if you have a testimony or something you'd like to share with the others, as Rick likes to say, this is a way of paying back the foundation in so many ways. So you're all invited to be there if you can fit it into your schedule. Then, of course, Tuesday we have the One Planet, One Nation, One Race, again in the same public Zoom room of the Keshe Foundation. Wednesday, again, the Reactor Group, same public Zoom room, 939-474-503. That starts at 7 a.m. Central European Time on Wednesday. And then, of course, another Beautiful Knowledge Seekers workshop on Thursday. Hopefully you'll be able to join one or a number of those sessions. Thank you again, Alex. If there's no further questions or comments, I'll bring the session to a close. We'll play the final disclaimer. Anyone else have a thought, a question? Join us in the transmutation sessions if you can. The 14th session, a picture of the soul. Purchase some products out of the Keshe Foundation for yourself or for perhaps others who you'd like to. Again, as Mr. Keshe said, these things you can bring into the home and you'll change the whole emotion of the place. But he's also, as we've stated, about washing the floors, the windows, and the rest of it with certain combinations. You don't have to go to the store for that. Although, as we heard Gianni say, he's made probably more Ganses than all of us put together. But when he received Ganses from the Keshe Foundation store, he said the power or the energy within those Ganses were more powerful than he's ever experienced. So you could see from someone who I'd call a so-called expert, at least according to his understanding, there's a marked difference between what we make and at our homes and what we can find in the Keshe Foundation store. And I hope you all see the connection between the store, keeping Keshe Foundation free, and the development of the technology at this stage. I know there'll be research groups forming in the future. Hopefully governments will give grants or bring some of their nationals into this, and we'll have multiple research centers around the world. I think this is part of the plan of the Keshe Foundation, but we'll have to see. Mr. Keshe may have some items that are very well developed and others that, like with the growing teeth, I think he's going to leave that up to researchers or dentists or others who will take up that particular aspect of the technology. So it'll be developed over a period of time and tested. But yes, the party has just begun. And of course, we've waited a long time, not as long as some have waited, as we know. But I think it's time. This is the year 2025, and thank you all for being a part of it and carrying a very small corner of this very large carpet. So see where you can fit in or what befits you to either support the foundation, to do running your tests at home and giving also feedback to that in the testimonials or in other groups, or as I say, purchase products that are just so far out of reach of our understanding that we couldn't possibly replicate them at this point, but you'll be able to use them. And I think as Mr. Kesh has indicated, these will all be made into very inexpensive systems that everyone can have, whether you have money or you have very little money. It'll probably still take some funds. All right, any other thoughts, questions, comments? Otherwise, I'll take the screen back. We'll share the screen. Thank you, Alex, again, for all your work in trying to, again, transfer some of this knowledge to us. I know Mr. Kesh has been working a long time. It's not an easy task, but I think as systems start to appear, and especially with the energy and other things, humanity will just become so enamored with this, as he said, people will start to walk away from the wrong side of the street, let's say, the war and destruction and the killing and the rest. And there's many options. I think, as we understand, we only understand about 5%, or he's only shared about 5% of what's actually happening within the Kesh Foundation. But we can, in a way, sense where this is going. And we know it's going to the world peace, which is just the next step in interaction, I think, with our space travel and, of course, with the larger family, which is what we refer to as the universal community.